There is much we don't know about what climate change might mean for us here in Ontario. What we do know, however, is that it will cost us. Peter Weltman is Ontario's Financial Accountability Officer. His office is working out how much and how best to approach it to get the best value for money. They have a new report about transportation, and Peter Weltman joins us now. Hi, Peter.
Hi, nice to be here.
It's nice to meet you in person because I think in the past when we spoke, you were on a little box there.
That's right.
So it's nice to see you here. We're seeing images from the States with Hurricane Ian and here closer to home with Hurricane Fiona, but I'll ask you anyway, why was it important to put this report together now?
So we were asked to do this report. We've been at this for about 2.5 years. This was a complicated report to do. And the idea initially was, what would the fiscal impact of climate change be? That was the original question. So how will climate change affect the government's finances? And where we kind of landed was, well, that's a pretty big ask. Let's try to see something about infrastructure. And then we had to narrow it down some more and say, okay, publicly owned infrastructure is well within the purview of the province. What will the impact be on that infrastructure that we all depend on? And how much will it cost the province's budget to maintain that infrastructure in light of climate change?
You said it was complicated. Why is it complicated?
It's complicated because we were looking at different data sets. So we were looking at climate data that was provided to us from Environment Canada, so projecting emissions scenarios over the next 100 years, combined with infrastructure data, so basically all the buildings and roads and everything that we own as a province, the condition of that infrastructure, so how worn is it, and then trying to assess the cost of, let's say, what happens when that excess heat hits the building. How do you prevent that from happening, and how much will it cost to prevent that from happening?
You said you've been working on this for 2.5 years. In 2.5 years, we seem to have a crisis, one crisis after another. So why do this now?
Well, we did it now because it was ready and we were getting a little, get it out the door. But basically, we're in climate change. It's happening now. We're seeing the impacts of it. It will affect the government's finances. I mentioned a whole bunch of other things too, but we're focused on government finances. And that's why we do this now, to give folks a sense as to what is it going to cost for us as a province and municipalities to keep the stuff we already own working and doing what we want it to do in light of the impacts of climate change.
Before we get into the cost and before we go into the report itself, I think like I mentioned, there's a lot of crises happening around the world right now. And in order for us to have the needle move, I think the public has to be aware of what's happening. And I think maybe people watching or listening might think, infrastructure, like, we've got so many problems, why focusing on this? And maybe some of us feel like, when we do look at what's happening with Fiona and with Ian, it's far away, it's not impacting us. I know you're a nonpartisan group, but how do you get people to care about something like this?
So our objective is to provide analysis for MPPs, and then they can use that to hold the government to account. So that's our mandate to do. What we do to try to, people will decide if they care about it on their own. But what we've done is we've tried to make these reports accessible so that people understand that these costs and climate change impacts all of us. The costs will impact all of us. So it's important that we all at least pay some attention to what's happening. To your point about some of these storms being far away, well, I'm from Ottawa. And in Ottawa in the last 4 years, we've had 2 100-year flooding events. So, I used to ride my bike downtown to work. That path has been all washed out for almost a year, for example, when I was working in Ottawa. So it's much closer to home than Florida and Fiona.
You mentioned reports. Can you tell us briefly about the other reports in the series that complement this one?
Yes, so we started off with a report on building infrastructure. And this one here is transportation infrastructure. And our final report, well, almost final report, is going to come out probably in a few months, and it'll deal with water infrastructure. The other things that we've done too is we've looked at the existing infrastructure from before and estimated what it would cost the province to bring everything to a state of good repair, because not all of our infrastructure is in a state of good repair, because we didn't want to confound those costs with the costs from climate change impacts.
So this report only looks at the direct cost to municipal and provincial taxpayers for repairing and replacing transportation infrastructure, not building new, right?
Exactly. It's the existing stuff that we have in the ground that we depend on. And that's why people might think, oh, infrastructure. But you know, the road you're driving on, the hospital you go visit, that's infrastructure. And we depend on those things. You're sitting in a classroom in school. If that school is not built to withstand the excess heat that's coming our way, that school may not be usable for folks. So that's why it's important.
Well, you mentioned heat, and I remember this summer, my kids were in school, and the classrooms, you just open the window, there's no air conditioning, there's a fan at the front of the, so everybody's feeling this impact.
When I was in school, there was no air conditioning in schools. That was a recently involved thing. And now, of course, it's become essential.
We're going to show two graphs to help understand your latest work, where let's start with this one, which reflects what cost would be without adaptation. And this is transportation infrastructure costing less now. We're looking at the graph. Peter, can you explain to us what it is that we're looking at?
So what you're looking at here is the cost to maintain in the dark bars. This is what it costs. Ontario municipalities have $330 billion worth of transportation infrastructure. And that infrastructure requires regular maintenance. Roads wear out, bridges wear out, et cetera. So the dark bars are really what it costs us now to maintain what we have and we would say in a stable climate. So if there was no climate change, from that, that last on the left-hand side, those series there, 2022 to 2100 would cost us $12.9 billion to maintain what we have in the ground over the rest of the century.
And that's if no weather changed.
Bingo, nothing, no climate change. The climate stays exactly as it is today. Okay. So then what we've done is we've looked at two emission scenarios. So what I mean by that is that as carbon gets emitted into the atmosphere, the planet heats up. And there is a trajectory that we're on right now. And the trajectory we're on right now is actually on the right-hand side is that high emissions scenario. So the more emissions, the more heat, the more climate impacts will be, the more costly it will be to maintain the existing infrastructure. The medium emissions scenario is assuming we get to net zero by around 2050 and keep things stable and they start to drop. So you see the cost there is a little bit lower than the high emissions scenario.
So what would the argument be against just building new?
Well, there's no argument against building new, but I think the important thing to keep in mind is that when we're building infrastructure today, especially roads and transportation, those are pieces of infrastructure that last 80, 90 years that are going to be in service. So decisions we make today are going to be quite valid, 60 years from now. So if you're designing, taking climate change into account, it makes sense to start thinking about how am I going to make this road more resistant to extreme heat, for example, 60 years from now. And I better build that into my cost today. Otherwise, I'm going to have to pay for it further out.
Going back to the graph, what do we infer from those graphs?
So the graphs show you basically that little bar on top there, the extra amount of money that we're going to have to spend to maintain the roads in state of good repair in light of climate change. So the $12.9 billion is assuming no change in climate. Mm-hmm. If we're in a medium emission scenario, you're going to have to add another 2.2 to that. If we're in a high emission scenario, it's another 4.1. So it doesn't sound like a lot of extra money, but and we do further in the report, we talk about some of the adaptation things you can do. But if you don't spend it today, this is what it's going to cost you if you don't do anything at all, right? Mm-hmm. This is the extra money you're going to have to spend. So it's just basically a way of telling government and everybody, this is what it's going to be. And then you can use this as a baseline to decide how you want to go forward in terms of maintaining and designing and planning for new infrastructure.
So if you don't pay now, you'll pay more later.
That's right.
I don't know if you've ever been to Africa, but
I have actually.
Okay, well, I'm from East Africa, and there's so many potholes that when you're driving on these roads, it's actually called like the African massage. So I don't know how many people want to experience that here, but just to, when you're driving, it's just up and down, up and down. But this report focuses on the province's transportation infrastructure, the single largest category of assets owned by the province and the municipalities. What types of timeline are we talking about when building and repairing infrastructure? So
what we did the report was between now and the end of the century. So the
50 years?
It's 78 years actually.
Yeah.
So over that 78-year period, and what you start to see in the chart is that for the next, up until 2030, the costs don't really vary very much between higher emissions or medium emissions or low emissions, but then after that they start to really diverge because there's a buildup of carbon in the atmosphere, and the more there's a buildup, the heat starts to become more and more extreme, and that starts to kick in a little later on. So that's also an important consideration. If you look at the cost chart, you'll see, as I said, it stays pretty stable, and then it starts to really diverge based on emissions.
But I'm sure people are listening to this and saying, I'm not going to be around when this happens. Why should I care about this right now?
Well, because, I mean, my kids will be around. Whether they have kids is a totally different question for another day, but my kids will be around. And folks will be around. And if we want, if we want our society to maintain the living standards that we have and to carry on, these are important considerations. Same reason we build schools, same reason we build hospitals. I'm not going to be around in 50 years or whatever the case is, but I depend on those hospitals today that maybe folks 50 years ago built.
We have another graph, and this one is to illustrate cost savings now.
Right.
And adapting transportation infrastructure will cost less than not adapting over the long term, just what we're talking about building on this. Peter, can you walk us through what it is that we're looking at right now?
So again, we have the two scenarios, the medium emissions on the left and the high emissions on the right. And the pink bar shows here's what we will have to spend to overall to manage and maintain our infrastructure if we do not do any adaptation. So we just basically carry on doing what we're doing. If stuff wears out, we replace it exactly as is. As we maintain things, we maintain it with the same technologies we use today. And you'll see those are the highest amounts of money that's going to cost the most if we don't do any adaptation. The blue is if we do a reactive adaptation, so different types of basically if something breaks, we fix it. The green is we go proactive and we say, okay, we know in 10 years this road's going to need to be rebuilt, so we're going to rebuild it to a higher spec. We're not going to wait till it breaks. We're going to rebuild it on schedule. So again, really what it comes down to is if you spend the money in advance, it's going to cost you less over the long term than if you wait until you have to fix the problem.
Those numbers are really high because we're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars. There's a lot of unknowns out there. This report only covered heat, rain, freeze, thaw. To what extent is this report and the costs associated with it just the tip of the iceberg?
This is that's an important thing to remember. This is a very narrowly scoped report. There are multiple climate hazards. There is wind, there's freezing rain, there's flooding. We don't cover those.
And we can't predict those.
Well, others are going to try to. I think there's a report that was out yesterday by the Climate Institute that tried to look at those sorts of things. We didn't go there. We looked at the 3 climate hazards that would have the most impact on publicly on infrastructure that we're talking about, and for which there's enough data to reasonably forecast the costs. For example, flood data will have a very big impact, or flooding will have a big impact, but there's very little good flood of data available right now, so you can't use that to do any forecasting. And third thing ultimately is we're not a big shop, so we had to scope it back. So this would be considered a minimum, if you will. The thing to keep in mind though is if adaptation starts soon, then what you end up with, you may have to spend some money up front, but what you end up with is a suite of infrastructure that is reasonably climate resilient. And then you're not going to necessarily have to deal with some of these huge problems that happen when the infrastructure fails because of climate change. You have a heavy rainstorm, it washes out a road in BC, and all of a sudden you've got people cut off from the mainland, you've got huge economic dislocation. If that road, for example, and I'm not saying it would or wouldn't have, but if that road had been able to withstand that heavy rain, all that extra cost and damage would have been avoided.
Well, you mentioned the mudslides in BC. So what are some of the other factors that need to be considered?
So in terms of road building, there's a couple that are probably easiest to understand. So there is technology, there is asphalt out there right now that is more resistant to heat than some of the current stuff we're using. We saw in Europe this past summer, we actually had roads melting. So because of the heat, but there is material that is more expensive that can be used to withstand these higher temperatures. So that's an example. And then there's certainly bridges. When you're building bridges, if you dig the foundation a little bit deeper than you might have done in the past, you do make it more resilient to the extra water that comes around with rain.
So would you sum up the report as being proactive adaptation rather than being reactive?
Well, the report doesn't really recommend. What it does is it lays out costs of being proactive versus reactive. And, there are lots of pressures on governments. There are, all kinds of other things to have to think about. But it just lays out a starting point saying this is what, our best estimate in terms of the future costs. Clearly, if you start to adapt now and proactively, you're going to save yourself probably some fairly big amount of money in the future. But that's the starting point, right? So then you start to be able to say, okay, well, it's going to cost us more. We might be able to save more. So maybe it's worth it, or maybe we say we can't afford it right now, we'll just have to deal with it as it comes.
What would you say to, again, we mentioned all the crises that governments are faced with right now. What would you say if there is an argument that says that being reactive might actually cost less? So let's just wait and see, because maybe the infrastructure will be able to withstand these changes.
Well, sure. I mean, again, we're not recommending any particular decision. We're just trying to lay out what the potential implications are of doing things and not doing things. The also thing to remind ourselves is we're projecting 78 years out into the future using climate data. Like, what is the climate going to be, and how is that going to impact rain, and how is that going to impact a whole lot of things? There's a lot of uncertainty in these estimates, and that's why in our report we show the range of uncertainty. And in some cases, if we hit the lowest potential result, then in some cases it maybe not make sense to do any replacement ahead of time.
What for you is the most important takeaway in this report?
The most important takeaway is that what we build now, what we maintain now, these are things that need to last us for a lifetime, effectively. Decisions we make today are going to be consequential 50, 60, 80 years from now. So it's really important that we think about what we want this infrastructure to do, how we want to live in the future, and think and incorporate that into design and planning today. And now that we've put out some costs, we can actually do some cost-benefit analysis on some of the different options available. Do we use the better technology today? Do we wait a little bit? Do we build that road, or do we find another way to get folks from A to B? That sort of thing.
I want to stress that your office is nonpartisan, but it is municipal election season. Given your report, what should citizens be asking candidates when they do come to the door?
I think it'd be an interesting thing to ask. Okay, so what kind of shape is our stuff in? Like how resilient is our infrastructure? Do we as a city, as a municipality, have a good handle on what we own and what its condition is and what it'll cost to maintain it? Because honestly, when we've done the work, the municipal data is not great. Some of the larger centers have good data, but this is a lot of work to do, and it takes a lot of time and expertise. So it's not easy to compile this stuff. But I would be asking those questions. How well do you know the stuff we have? What's it going to cost, and what's it going to cost to keep it going?
In our final moments last week, you released a new report. What is that report on?
So that report looked at a pretty big component of the provincial government, which is compensation for employees. And the government spends, roughly $48 billion a year on compensation and wage compensation. And when we were doing our economic and budget outlook last spring, we said, geez, we're getting into a period of high inflation. Wonder how that's going to impact the compensation envelope. Let's have a look at that. So we did a 5-year forecast. We said, here's what it looks like right now. And then we layered on what will happen if inflation, has an impact on wage negotiations. What could a potential cost be there from the impacts of inflation? And then we looked at some of the promises that have been made by the government, including adding extra long-term care beds, adding more care for long-term care homes, adding more childcare, and building more 1,300 new hospital beds. And all those things need employees, they need staff. So you're effectively creating a whole bunch of new positions. And what will that impact be on the wage envelope? And then thirdly, as we were putting this together, we find out, Bill 124 is being challenged in court. Wonder what that would cost if somehow that bill gets defeated and they have to repeal it.
How much?
So we laid that in. So what our report says is that Bill 124 is saving the government about $9.7 billion, but if it gets repealed, the government it might cost an extra $8.4 billion to compensate for that bill should it be defeated in court.
Lots of zeros.
Lots of zeros.
Peter, I don't know how your office does it. You're the little train that could. Really, really do appreciate you making time for us and helping us understand these really complex issues.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to explain the work.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.